If we are, happy birthday. So I just wanted to update you quickly on our elevator. It's not a pretty story. I have one more hope in electrician that I'm working on, and if that doesn't work, we'll take a vote and maybe we'll have to go back to the other building for our brown bag lunches so that it's easier for people to get in and out. So it's not that we've forgotten, we're working hard on it, but one of those things. Just like to remind everybody that the big Davenport train show is this Saturday on the 28th. And almost always, for years now, we've had a table there talking about Jackson County's great experience with the railroads and our own narrow gauge railroad. They've always given us a free table and it's been a wonderful thing for us. This year we're just not making it. There's so many things going on. But if any of you are in Davenport or looking for something to do, I think it's 9 to 4, Saturday the 28th. It's on the Mississippi Valley Fairgrounds. Just stop in and say hello. There's wonderful, wonderful things to see there, and I feel bad that we're not there. We should be, because it just gets a lot of people from the Quad Cities to come up and look at our wonderful depot and our train car and all those sort of things. Brown bag lunch for next week on the 31st. I think we're going to be talking about Colonel J.J. Woods. There's a great story about him. He was a Civil War hero. And a lot of controversy about a painting that we have of him in our other museum that some of our experts who have come through during muster on the Maquoketa have said to us, you have this picture misidentified. Well, we've been working with West Point. He graduated from West Point first in his class, and he took Ulysses S. Grant's spot. After the war, he came back to Maquoketa, and he owned the Maquoketa Excelsior for a long time. He was actually mayor of Maquoketa. He had relatives here, Bert Dustall and Zelda Dustall, part of their family. We don't think we can possibly have his picture misidentified. So you hear all about that great story next time, I hope, next week. Also want to tell you that our 250th birthday of our country, this is our program for March. And we're glad you're here for that, but want to remind you that on May 23rd, please put on your calendar. It's a Saturday, and we will be at Andrews Cemetery honoring our heroes there. On June 6th, there will be a soiree for the 250th birthday at Squires Manor. And so you'll be hearing a lot more about that as time goes along. So, want to thank Michelle Turner for being here today. She's our Master Gardener Extraordinaire.
Oh, I'm not a Master Gardener.
Oh, sorry, she's not.
I taught horticulture. I was a horticulture teacher.
A horticulture teacher, I stand corrected. All right. She does about everything, and she does it really well, so it surprises me. All right. So welcome. She's going to talk about 250 years of gardening in the USA.
We'll be glad to have her.
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Last time somebody said in the back they couldn't hear me, so I'm going to have to talk a little louder. Okay, so we decided to do 250 years of gardening. That way I can kind of incorporate my other hats. I'm the director of the Limestone Bluffs RC&D, and I'm the Soil and Water Commissioner, and I taught horticulture and BOAG for quite a few years. So this is a way to incorporate it into our 250, our history. So if we're talking about history, obviously we can go back to the beginning of time, right? When we were hunter-gatherers, and then go a little bit further, and we have the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. But we wanted to try and concentrate on North America and a little bit about the evolution of gardening here. So that's what we're going to talk about. So we've got to start with 1565. The Spaniards come. I don't know how many of you have been down to Florida to St. Augustine, but that is our oldest city, our oldest town in the United States. And when they came here, they brought with them goods that they brought not only from Spain, but from the other countries that they had visited first. Remember, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, right? Well, the Spaniards were already in the West Indies. They were already collecting things like sugar cane and citrus fruits. And so they were the first ones to start bringing these imports to the United States. 1607, the English colonists came, they started Jamestown. Well, that didn't work out so well. You know, they had several hundred people, and after a year, there was about 38 of them left. They didn't have, you know, time to garden. They lived basically, and there are estimates that their diets were 90% meat. They didn't have time to till a garden. The New England area is very rocky. So traditionally, New England gardens are very small. New England farms are very small. They had to take by hand all of the rock out of the fields. And that's why New England looks like England, because it has all of those rock fences. You know, when you've got a lot of rock, what do you do with it? You gotta make a fence. So anyway, they didn't have the time to garden the way we think of gardening, and they didn't have the space. You know, they were busy chopping down trees and trying to make shelters, and they had to make their own clothes, and anything they got really was imported for the first, you know, 20 years, 30 years, was imported from England. What they did get was a little bit of help from the Native Americans. So they got the Three Sisters. They got the squash, they got the beans, they got the corn, right? But it didn't start off great. So 1620, now the Pilgrims arrive, and they didn't go through the starvation times that the Jamestown people did. I mean, they called it the starving time for a reason. So the Pilgrims came. They actually had several agreements with the Native Americans, and so they were able to do a little bit of more trading and start planting some native crops and maize. Americans are the only one that call it corn. Everybody else calls it maize. So originally, that grassy looking substance there, that is what corn originally looked like. It was called teosinte, and it came from South America, and it made its way up here. And the heads were very small, and the kernels, I mean, think more like wheat and rye. It kind of looked like that. And then eventually, when they selectively bred it, then you would get these really odd-shaped, different colored corns. But they didn't eat it off the corn, off the cob. They would dry it and they would pound it into flour. So that's why the Mexican area has tortillas. That's basically how they were made, or into what we call squaw bread, which I guess we shouldn't say that anymore, but that's what they did. So when they did finally settle, they started to have, you know, their own little house that they were going to stay in. You know, they were very mobile there at the beginning. Then they could have their little area gardens. So there were two types of gardens. They would call them a potager garden, and that would be basically their kitchen garden. So it would have the fruits and vegetables that they were going to have. Flowers were not a big thing in their garden because it was a luxury. If you couldn't eat it, don't waste your time on it, right? And then the physic gardens. The physic gardens, anybody want to take a guess? Physic gardens? Those were the medicinal gardens. That's where, you know, they didn't have doctors. And back in the day, you had to be an herbalist. You had to know what herbs were going to cure your different illnesses. And so they would keep a separate garden for all of their herbs. And, you know, eventually those that were really good at it became witches. So you know, you wanted to be good, but not that good, right? So what else did they eat? Well, they did a lot of foraging. And today, a lot of people are kind of bringing this back. They're foraging and trying to live off the land, you know. If the big one comes, you better be able to eat off your front lawn. So they would eat things like lamb's quarter. I don't know if anybody in here has eaten lamb's quarter, but it grows everywhere. If it's in your garden, keep it there. Just eat it. Chickweed. Chickweed is great in omelets. So there's a lot of things that you can eat, and that's what they did. Unfortunately, they also brought these things with them. Dandelions are not native to the United States. You can eat every part of it. The whole thing is edible. But, thank you, pilgrims, they brought it in. Purslane also. Purslane is a very common weed around here, and it makes a great like chutney or a relish. Really good. So instead of treating these as the weeds and the imports that they are, start eating them. They make great salad greens. You can fry the heads of the dandelions. Just butter them and put a little bit of breadcrumbs on them, and they're fantastic.
What's the one on the left?
The purslane. The purslane is really fleshy, so it really makes a nice relish. So one of the things that one of the vegetables that they normally would plant and that they brought with them were carrots, but these don't look like carrots, right? The original carrots were purple, and then some of them were white, and think parsnips, right? Parsnips are white, and then they had a little bit of a yellow tinge. We didn't get yellow carrots until the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century, when the Dutch started selectively breeding for the orange color. And rumor has it they did it to honor William of Orange. But anyway, so we would not necessarily recognize today the vegetables that they ate back then because they were in their natural state. And you can still get the purple ones, and they're really kind of cool because if you cut them, sometimes they have orange in the center. They're really pretty. So it's a nice thing to add to be a little bit different. When the Dutch came and they settled Manhattan, they did bring with them some flowers. And the tulips were like the best thing that the Dutch invented, right? Unfortunately, tulip mania hit around 1620, and the price of a tulip bulb went for like $10,000. And people were so obsessed with the tulips that it actually broke the economy. And it just destroyed the Dutch economy because it was so artificially inflated by these tulips. But, you know, we like to see the tulips now. And if you look in the catalogs, sometimes you're going to pay a lot of money for them. One of the nice varieties was the broken tulips. And these were truly broken. We call them broken because the color is broken up, but a truly broken tulip is broken because it has a virus. And so those viruses cause this broken pattern. Well, they were all the rage, everybody wanted them, they were paying big bucks for them. The problem is, after a couple generations, the virus actually kills it. So it's not as sustainable. George Washington had some true broken tulips in his garden, but they don't last long. So now the ones that we have that are variegated and striped or broken are not truly broken. They're bred to be that way without the virus. So what kind of fruits and vegetables did they eat? Apples were very popular, except the only native apple to North America is the crab apple. And so they didn't eat them fresh. They would make them into jellies and jams and juices, or wine. They also brought in the tobacco. Well, tobacco was already used by the natives for centuries, but they started growing it and exporting it, and tobacco became the #1 crop for money back in the day. So if you had the luxury of having a large amount of land, then you could grow tobacco and actually have an income. Everybody else had very small yards. So think about it today. If you live in town, could you put in a garden in your yard to supply enough food for the entire year? It would be something you could do if you worked at it. But that means you wouldn't be able to wash your clothes by hand and start your fires and cook your food, you know, starting early in the morning and take care of your 10 kids. And so true gardening, in the way we think of it, was really for the rich people, the wealthy people. A lot of the poor people, commoners, had to depend on markets for a lot of their food. Jamestown law had mandatory orchards, so if you lived in Jamestown after the starving times, this makes sense, you had to have fruit and vegetables. You had to, because otherwise you would starve. And we're trying to get back to that. Try to remember to talk about the food forests later, but we're trying to incorporate that idea of we should all have fruit trees in our yard. So we'll talk about, you know, these really quick. The first public park in Boston now in 1640, people are starting to have a little bit of free time so they can go to a park and look at pretty gardens. So we're not only talking about sustainable gardens as far as eating them, but also to enjoy them, to look at them and appreciate the landscape. The palace gardens, and why they called it a palace, you know, back in the day everybody was a king or a queen, or and they had palaces. So the governor's palace gardens in Williamsburg, Virginia, they had actual gardens to enjoy. And then the first botanical gardens in Philadelphia, people were now paying money to go see the beautiful plants, which most of them were coming from someplace else, right? They were being imported. Robert Prince opens the first nursery in 1737. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, my mom was a great landscaper, as was my grandmother and my great-grandmother. And every year, it was just the greatest thing for me to go to the different nurseries, and Mom would buy different plants, shrubs, trees, whatever. But you know, it's a luxury. And then the first landscape gardens. So by the middle of the 1700s, people are starting to garden for fun, just for enjoyment, or go to look at other ones. So other key milestones, plant hybridization. To this point, you had plants that were natural. If they hybridized on their own. But Thomas Fairchild in London was the first one to actually say, hey, I wonder if I can breed something to something else. So he crossed a dianthus with another dianthus, which would be a sweet william with a carnation. So they were close enough relatives, and he bred them together. And they called it Fairchild's mule. Well, they called it a mule because, as we all know, mules are sterile, right? So people were kind of like, wow, what good is that, you know? Because you can't give me seeds for it. So they weren't sure that the hybridization was going to really take off. Cotton Mather, I don't know if you know how much you know about Cotton Mather and history and the Salem witch trials and stuff. That man was into everything, and the fact that he started crossing or watching that native corn was starting to cross. We're starting to see more science come into gardening and landscaping. And you know, you can read these. I think everybody knew Gregor Mendel. from the high school science classes, and he was the first one to do experiments with peas and figure out, oh, well, if I breed this one to this one, I get hybrid vigor, you know, and two short ones might get me a short one, but a short one and a long one might get me a super long one. So that's all going on in the early 1800s. One of the first beautiful shrubs to come over from Europe and Asia was the lilac. And I think because we have so many lilacs around and the old homesteads had lilacs, we tend to think of it as a native, but it's not a native. And now there are hundreds of varieties of lilacs, and they were known basically for their smell. They were, you know, they're beautiful, their smells, and now they come in white and purple and pink and variegated and all different colors. And if you ever want to see a large collection of them, go to Rochester, New York. Supposedly they have one of the largest collections of lilacs anywhere in the country. And it's a really nice time to go in the spring. So George Washington, if you were here when I talked about George Washington, he had 4 gardens. And you know, when you compare him to the commoner and the pilgrims and everything, it's like, wow, you know, you really did need money, and you needed slaves or somebody to actually do the work. So the people with the pretty gardens are the ones who had the money to have them. And Thomas Jefferson also. For some reason, when we think about the history of gardening and the different plants that we use, everybody gives a lot of emphasis on Jefferson and not a lot on Washington, but a lot of the things that Jefferson had, he got from Washington, and the two of them talked about gardening a lot, probably more than politics. So we're in the late 1700s, Bernard McMahon opens the first seed store. I mean, there isn't one of us that loves to garden that doesn't look forward to the seed catalogs, right? It's like, whoa, you know, Sears and Roebuck or JCPenney's Christmas issue. It's like, wow, let's look through this. Well, he starts the first seed store in Philadelphia, and this is when Lewis and Clark bring back all of the things that they have collected. And so he has the wherewithal to think, oh, you know, maybe I should preserve some of these. So a lot of them are in the Smithsonian. They're dried, pressed, and the notes from Lewis and Clark where they found them. So it's really interesting history. And it also gives us an insight as to what was growing there before we settled the West. The first seed and florist shop catalog, 1802. So I brought, you know, those of us who like to garden, it's like, woohoo, look, we've got something. You know, and now you're talking, this is about the time that printing presses, Benjamin Franklin, now things can be printed and given to the public. You couldn't have a catalog if you didn't have printers. So that was kind of a neat progression. And as people started to migrate to the West, once we had the Louisiana Purchase, it was like, go, let's load those wagons and let's go west. And we brought all of the things that we had gathered in the East out here to the Midwest and Iowa. And think about what this area looked like pre-settlement. Around here, this is Timber City. Lots and lots of timber, lots of trees. We did not have the huge cedar population that we have today because what do? We chop down all the trees, and now those cedars can get a hold. And we brought with us a lot of other trees and shrubs. And ethnically, if you are from Germany or Poland or Italy or wherever, there are certain crops that are common in your area. I can remember my Polish great-grandmother. Her garden was full of things that were very popular in Europe, but not so much here. She had mountain ash trees all over her farm. which are very popular in Poland, and they eat mountain ash. They eat the berries. Not so much here. But, you know, think about your own grandparents and think about what they had on the farm and the different flowers that you don't see anymore. I can remember as a little kid, my mom always had balsam planted along the driveway, and they had these cool little poppy seed pods, and it was just fun for a little kid to pop them. Well, you hardly ever see them. In fact, I tried finding some seed and I couldn't find any because they were hybridized into what we now call impatiens. And impatiens are like, oh, the rage, right? Everybody wants impatiens. They forget about the roots, where they came from. So that's why these heritage varieties, you look through these catalogs and you can get some of those things that you remember Grandma planting. Or if you go to some of the old farmsteads, you can still find some of these old varieties that are still, you know, growing. Hollyhocks. Do you see hollyhocks like you used to see them? How sad is that? I love hollyhocks and foxgloves. But anyway, that was a little aside. So the first time that tomatoes are mentioned is in the Virginia Housewife. It was a recipe book by Mary Randolph, 1824. To this point, they really didn't grow tomatoes. I mean, that's our #1 garden crop, right? Tomatoes. But back then, tomatoes were thought to be what? Anybody know? Poisonous, right? They were in the nightshade family. So potatoes, peppers, tomatoes, they were like, oh, you can't eat those, they're deadly. Well, they are in the nightshade family, but the poor people, for lack of anything else to eat, they were eating tomatoes. And they were noticing, I'm not dying. But the rich people were eating tomatoes, and they were keeling over. And the rich people are like, whoa, tomatoes are deadly, you can't eat them. Well, rich people eat off of pewter. And when you put acid tomatoes on a pewter plate, it creates the ability for the body to absorb more lead. So all these rich people that are eating tomatoes are dying of lead poisoning, not tomato poisoning. And it took a while to figure that out. But it wasn't until the 1800s that tomatoes became very popular. So in 1820, Congress decides, hey, we need to have a national botanical garden. And it seems strange that you would have to pass an act of Congress to make a beautiful garden, but they did. Something interesting, James Brown in 1829 in Fishkill, New York, he was made a master gardener for this estate. He was a self-emancipated slave, so he was an escaped slave who made his way up to New York, and he was so renowned as a gardener that, and he kept a diary, and it became a 10-volume diary on everything that he did in the garden, and it documented life in the Hudson Valley of New York, and so he became very respected, which is unusual for someone of color in that time. So that was kind of like, wow, that's kind of neat. Mount Auburn Cemetery designs designs a garden, and this is getting into the Victorian era when it was very common for people to have picnics in the cemetery. That was the place to go. So cemeteries had to start planting really pretty shrubs and flowers. And some of our older cemeteries in cities today have vestiges of those, they're not planting them for the dead people, they're planting them for the people that were coming in and having picnics. They would picnic next to Grandpa's grave and spend the day out there. 1841, a treatise on the theory and practice of landscape gardening. So now we start to see books being published, because other people want to know how to garden, how to landscape. So let's bring this a little bit closer to home. Sewell Foster. He started the Fountain Hill Nursery in Iowa. And he was a writer, he was an influencer, and he was like, you know what? We need to start training people about horticulture. So he campaigned and he campaigned, and we got the Iowa Agriculture College, which is now Iowa State, right? So we would not have an Iowa State if it wasn't for this man and his love of horticulture. He's the one who pushed it through. And so I think that's kind of neat. Elsewhere in the country, now we start to see large parks and botanical gardens. Central Park in New York City is about 643 acres. It's a fantastic park in the middle of skyscrapers, right? It's a good thing they had the foresight in 1858, because otherwise that would be all buildings. And Victorian gardens become all the rage. Throughout these 1800s, and even today, you get different periods of styles. It's just like clothes styles. You have gardening styles. And the Victorian knot gardens with all their fancy boxwood became very popular. And so this Victorian era was the time of exploration. This is when you had archaeologists and botanists going around the globe and literally raping the land. They didn't care if they took every last specimen. They wanted it for their own. They wanted to sell it. And so you see lots and lots of plants coming in now from all over the globe. Now let's bring it back to home again. So in 1866, Iowa State Horticulture Society is formed. So you have enough people now interested that they form a society. They're not just gardening in their backyard, they got to garden with other people, right? It's more fun, Master Gardeners. 1869 is when they started to offer horticulture classes. So it started out as forestry, which would give you your botany background, but it was several years before they actually incorporated horticulture classes. And J.L. Budd was the first professor. He was a well-known horticulturalist. And George Washington Carver, he's not an Iowan, but he made Iowa State famous. He was a friend of Budd's daughter, Etta, and they were going to school in another state, and she said, you know what? You should go to Iowa State, or the Agriculture College in Iowa. And she asked her dad if he could stay with them. So he stayed with the Budds, and he was the very first person of color to go to Iowa State. And he was the very first black person to get a BA, an MA, master's degree, and he did amazing things. So they have a statue there, they have Carver Hall. I mean, it's quite amazing that Iowa has this first. And so he was very famous for all of his innovations in not only farming, but horticulture. And eventually he went to teach at Tuskegee in Alabama. Cannot talk about horticulture in Iowa without talking about the muscatine melons. This was started, early in the 1900s, more like the 1920s, and they have a lot of sandy soil down there, and melons love sandy soil. And they said at some point in the heyday, there was 850 train loads of melons coming off of 2,500 acres of melons. They were just booming back then. And still today, right? We still see them today. The grape industry in Iowa was huge back in the mid-1800s. But what happened? Oh, corn came in. So it was more profitable. And we didn't really have the varieties that grew well here. And something happened in, the 1920s, what happened? Prohibition. So all those grapes were grown for wine, which was great until you couldn't drink the wine. So down went the grapevines and out came the corn. And so the ones that were remaining, unfortunately, were hit hard by drift. So if you were spraying your fields with herbicide, that drift would drift over onto the remaining grapes, and it put an end to the industry. So 1919 was the peak of its production. Terrace Hill, anybody ever been to Terrace Hill in Des Moines? Yeah, that's really, really pretty. Built in 1866. The landscaper, Mr. Ellison, was actually the gardener for Buckingham Palace. And the owner, Mr. Allen, who wanted this built, had a lot of money. And so he brought Buckingham Palace's gardener here to Iowa to design his garden. Pretty interesting, huh? And just to keep it in context, we now have our first national park. So, 1892, Arnold Arboretum is opened in Harvard University. Capitol Gardens at the Capitol, the US Capitol, is finally designed. And these, I'm throwing out these names, these are people well known in the horticulture industry. The 1876 Expo had a huge horticulture hall. But the most important one is 1878, the Burpee Seed Company established. That's incredible that we're still buying Burpee seed. I used to live in upstate New York, and Burpee Seed had a lot of fields up there. And boy, there's nothing prettier than looking out and seeing rows and rows of rainbow colors of different flowers. It's just, so nice to see. And I kind of miss the old-fashioned seed catalogs or the seed bags, or they used to have the boxes with the labels on them. Really cool artwork. And when you're talking about gardening and gardening for fun, for pleasure, you have to add those gazing balls and, the wind chimes and the little flags and the little statues. So that's a part of gardening, right? And that became very popular around the Victorian era and the arts and crafts movement in the art world. And gazing balls were also called butler balls, because the butler was not supposed to look at the people in the garden, but he could look to the side and look into the ball, which would be a mirror to reflect on the people. So he was spying on them, so that's why they were called butler balls. They also called them witches' balls because they believed that the bad spirits would be sucked into these balls and captured. All kinds of neat reasons to have balls in your garden. So, the tomato, let's go back to that tomato, because by now we're eating them. Everybody's eating them. Well, is it a fruit or is it a vegetable? Yeah, it's both, but there was an act of Congress. Boy, it just, all these acts of Congress, right? 1893, Congress decrees, it's an act, that they are vegetables. Yes, yes. They are vegetables according to law, because if they're fruit, there's 0% of tariff. But if they're vegetables, there's 10%. Oh, it's all a money game. And there were people that stood up in front of Congress and yelled and screamed, "They're fruits, they're fruits." Yeah, but most of us eat them as vegetables, so we're gonna rule it as vegetables and take the money. Yeah.
Oh, it's funny.
So we're still in the late 1800s. It's the arts and crafts movement, and that's why we see all these fun things in the garden. And now we have the American Seed Trade Association. And at one time I thought I might want to be a seed trader. I was somewhere. I think I was in Iceland visiting, and there was someone staying in our hotel, and he was a seed association trader. And I thought, what a fun job. You just travel around the world with your little seed catalog. You want to buy some? It's like, what a great job. But yeah, 1800s, late 1800s. And again, beauty from nature. They didn't want anything. They were more wholesome. So you're getting out of the Victorian era and getting a little looser. I mean, you go from the tight Victorian era to the loosey-goosey 1920s, right? So the gardening kind of followed that path. The Ladies' Garden Club of Athens, Georgia, 1891. So that is the first garden club in the whole United States. Yeah. 1900, first landscape architect school, so people are now learning how to design gardens for other people. And then in 1902, Fanny Parsons said, you know, we should have our kids growing gardens at school. So she was kind of the precursor to what would eventually become FFA, Future Farmers of America. Well, Future Farmers of America, we call them FFA now. That was a sad day for me when they changed the name. We also had the Great Migration, so we now have all of these slaves that are emancipated. A lot of them moved north, but they brought with them the things that they were used to eating. The black-eyed peas, and the yams, and the kale, and the okra. So they helped migrate some of these different things to the north. When I was talking about the Victorian era, when they were just raping the world and bringing all these plants everywhere, finally somebody realized we're bringing in a lot of diseases, we're bringing in a lot of insects, we need to have a plant quarantine act. And even today, we are still plagued by diseases and insects that are coming from all over. The Garden Club of America, so instead of having just local garden clubs, now all those local garden clubs are becoming united into Garden Clubs of America. And it's the rise of the lawn. Oh, look at that. You know, before the lawns were nothing more than bowling greens for the king and the earls. And now, you know, as lowly commoners, we can have a beautiful garden or beautiful lawn. Going back to that Plant Quarantine Act, and the lawn reminded me of this. So these early lawns, they did something called polling or switching. And some golf greens do this today. They would take a very long pole and they would sweep it across the lawn. And they would do this to get rid of the dew, break up the dew so it would dry faster so they could mow it. It would also keep dollar spot, which is a disease, a fungus, from spreading. And it also broke down the earthworm casts. You know, earthworms leave that pile, this cast of poop and dirt and stuff, you know, on top of the ground. And if you were bowling on it, you didn't want those little bumps, so they would sweep or pole those down. Well, let's go back to those imports. When our early settlers were bringing in the potted plants and, you know, the soil in the boats for ballast, they had earthworms in them. Earthworms are not native to the United States. They are imports. Yeah, it's shocking, isn't it? But 10,000 years ago, we had the glaciers, and the glaciers essentially destroyed earthworms in the United States outside of the severe South. So when they brought in their potted plants or emptied the ballast from the ships, it had earthworms in it. So those red wrigglers, those jumping worms, you know, your earthworms, the terrestrial earthworms, they were brought in. So there are still some states, especially Minnesota, any states that have a lot of timber, they have these red signs with the X through it, you know, with a little worm on it. No worms allowed. They are so detrimental to forest soil. Forest soil is very, very shallow. It needs that leaf litter on it. Well, you bring in earthworms and they eat that leaf litter. They make the soil soft so it erodes. And then your salamanders and your other insects that live in that litter have no place to live, so they die. Oh, earthworms are bad. They're bad, bad, bad. The only thing is, we promote them for our gardens, and it's a conundrum. Wait, why do we want them in our gardens? Well, because when you garden, you till the soil, right? You have now modified the natural order of things. And when you till soil, you break down the soil structure and you create compaction. How are you going to get rid of the compaction? You use an earthworm, right? So, because we have modified how we garden and modified the land, and on a big scale, farming, right? And that's why we're hoping people go to no-till. We need these little wigglers, but it's one of those funny conundrums that we take it for granted. They're good for us, just like the pheasants. Don't get me started. So. 1922, who hasn't read Better Homes and Gardens, right? And where's it from? Des Moines. Isn't that amazing? That is just so cool that one of the most popular #1 magazines for gardening is from Des Moines. And I think that's great. So now we get to World War I, World War II. They had the war gardens, the victory gardens. They wanted everybody to do their bit and pull together and grow their own food and save money, and that was great, right? Dr. Carrot. Why do people eat carrots? Right? For your eyes? Well, there is a modicum of truth in there. It's not going to cure your eyes, but carotene is vitamin A. Vitamin A is good for your eyes. This was a poster that was put out by the RAF, the Royal Air Force in England. And you don't know which story to believe. They said Dr. Carrot was put out there to trick the Germans because the fighter pilots were hitting all their targets. They were bombing everything. And the Germans are like, how are they doing that? Because they eat carrots. They got great night vision, right? Well, it was a ploy because they had developed radar. And they didn't want the Germans to know that they had radar. So they said, it's the carrots. So the Germans started feeding carrots to their soldiers so they would have good night vision.
That's hilarious.
When they approached the RAF and said, is this really true? They were like, well, we kind of think that maybe because they were on rations, and people were starving and people weren't eating right, they said, well, at least they could have a healthy diet during the war if they would eat their carrots. So which one is true? They said the RAF went along with the myth of the radar, but fooled everybody. So now we start to see different types of gardens. In 1937, the League of Southern California Japanese Gardens is designed. Who doesn't love a Japanese garden? They are beautiful. They have color, they have shape. But if you go back far enough, the Japanese got their gardening techniques from the Chinese. And so it's kind of strange that you don't see Chinese gardens, but you do see Japanese gardens. And if you want to go back even further, in 1907, a group of Japanese families moved to South Florida, Delray Beach. 1907, hardly anybody lived in Florida in 1907. Mosquitoes and heat and swamps. But they started the Yamato colony. And the Yamato colony was there for years and years and years. But then what happened in the 1940s? Well, World War II, right? And what did we do with the Japanese? Well, we put them in concentration camps, essentially. But the ones in Florida, you know, some of them moved back to Japan, some of them, you know, were hiding out. But the families that stayed there was the Murakami family. And in 1977, George Murakami donated the colony land to the city of Delray. And if you are ever in South Florida, you have to go to the Murakami. They have the most beautiful Japanese gardens, and they have a museum there. So, you know, when we think of our early colonists and we think of, you know, German, Polish, Irish, we don't think that there were Japanese colonists that early in the United States, especially in Florida. That's the last place I'd have picked, and I've lived there. Okay, so now we have the 1950s and 60s. It's the rise of the suburbs. You know, those of us that were born back then, if we didn't live on the farm, our grandparents lived on the farm, right? Now, the kids that are being born today, they're 2 and 3 generations removed from the farm because everybody moved to the suburbs. Well, when everybody's living in the cities and living into the suburbs, things are starting to get old now, right? So they have to revitalize. And now they're thinking, oh, well, we can plant gardens. You know, what goes around comes around. So now they're trying to plant gardens. And in 1975, who doesn't remember Crockett's Garden? You know, that was the first TV. Well, first you have to have TV, right? And now you've got TV and you have gardening shows. Woohoo! 2000, very recently, there's a big push for community gardens. So people that live in the city that don't have large pieces of land, they can go to a community garden and get a plot and, you know, putz around. And they've become very, very popular. 2009, the vegetable garden returns to the White House. So for many years, there was no garden at the White House. But Michelle Obama is the one who said, you know, we need to have a garden. So she started the garden. Hillary Clinton got a $2.5 million grant from the seed company, from Burpee Seeds, to do a roof garden. I don't know who saw it, but 2.5, that's a lot of money for a roof garden. But anyway, Michelle Obama is the first one to bring it back to the White House. So now, you know, we're in recent times. There's so many things going on in gardening. These are all the hot topics. Tissue culturing, which is essentially cloning. I used to have my students clone carrots. It was very easy to do. You know, take a little tiny sliver of it and put it in your jelly, your agar, and you'd get all of these little identical genetic clones. And you can order clones from, if you want to do nursery stock, you can order trays and trays of these identical little plants. Genetic engineering, you know, we can take genes from one plant and put it into another to make it more cold hardy or pest resistant. So yeah, we're playing Frankenstein on a lot of things. Xeriscaping. Xeriscaping is taking your landscape and zoning it out so that, okay, things that need a lot of water get planted here, things that don't need a lot of water go over here, because traditionally people just planted things everywhere, put the sprinkler out, and everything got sprinkled the same. So xeriscaping means zone it out so that you know, well, I don't even have to water that section. It keeps your plants healthier. The push for native plants, because we went and we got all of these plants from all around the world, and so many of them don't belong here, or they don't thrive, and they've taken the place of our native plants. So we have to try and bring them back. And a lot of people argue, well, they're not as pretty. Okay, well, still, you can still find a place for them because our native bees, our native pollinators really need these native plants. Hydroponics, you know, there's those people that argue, well, we're farming too much of the land, we need this land to live on. We can do everything hydroponically, and hydroponically is growing in a soilless medium. So as long as you have something to keep the roots wet, you can hang them from the ceiling, you can, you know, and that's what a lot of hydroponics do. They hang them from the ceiling and they mist them with fertilizer water. Sustainability, let's not farm or let's not garden and waste a lot of our things. We don't need to have all of these plastic pots. We don't need to buy soil amendments. We can compost. So these are all, you know, things coming down the pike. Getting back to Iowa, Iowa developed the Chieftain apple, which is one of my favorite apples. Buck roses, crimson sweet watermelon, varieties of Weigelias, which is a flower, the corn gluten meal, bioregenerable containers or pots. So you can actually make plastic out of corn, and it's a heavy duty plastic. My FFA used to sell mugs that were made out of corn plastic, and different mats. I know if you're a gardener and you want to keep the weeds out, sometimes you'll put down mats, and a lot of those plastic sheetings would just, you know, they'd get ripped, they'd stay in the soil, they'd blow away, they never biodegrade. So you can get those that are made out of a biodegradable plastic, or you can use other things, other mulch materials. And, well, now we have the Iowa wine growers. So after all these years of not having any grapes, you know, we can remember here 30 years ago, people were starting to plant more grapes. And now, if you want to have a fun weekend, you can get the map and you can go winery hopping. There's a whole bunch of them in this area. So 2000, very recent, this is when we start to see, you know, the big surge in grapes. And now, you know, this is very futuristic. Our farming has become this thing of science fiction. We have indoor vertical farming. Vertical farming is when you have these little like pots or areas that you can tuck your little plants, and they grow vertical on walls. And it's essentially a hydroponic method, but it really condenses the space. If you ever go to Florida and you go to the Epcot Center, they have a ride called The Land, and it's basically all hydroponics. And you know, you've got tomatoes and you've got cucumbers, you know, hanging from the ceiling. Oh, cucumbers. I forgot to mention that. So George Washington, I'm going to pop back there. George Washington was one of the first people to have a greenhouse. But actually, greenhouses go back to the ancient Romans. Emperor Tiberius had to have a cucumber every day. And in order to do that, they had to build greenhouses. So he is supposedly the first guy who had a greenhouse because he had to have his cucumbers. So anyway, cover cropping is a big thing now, and even in our gardens, you know, we like to sometimes plant something after the crops have died, just to keep the ground from washing away. Digital ag, precision